let me start with the movie that we saw last night. It's really a masterpiece. It's something that has been needed in our world for a long time. My background and my connection with Israel began in the early 1980s. I was a Middle East correspondent based in Israel. And I went to Israel with, I think, the same preconceived notions that many U.S. reporters go to Israel with, that many foreign correspondents from other countries go to Israel with, and that is that basically the whole conflict in the Middle East comes down to two peoples struggling over a piece of land, and the general conventional wisdom is that, you know, we can find a compromise over this piece of land, and that's going to solve the problem. And it was not really until I had that on-the-ground experience in Israel that I began to understand that that is a incredibly simplistic and incorrect view of the Middle East conflict. And ever since then, I've written a great deal about the Middle East, some of the candid observations I've had, but I have not I've not been able to do that in the form of a book. I've published other people's books on the Middle East, but it's such a big topic. And what I love about the movie that Laurie and Stan did is they took this incredibly massive topic and in what, an hour, little over an hour, presented a very compelling and persuasive case for Israel. I don't think that's ever been done before, certainly not in the video form. And so it's a very, very important documentary, and you know, I look forward to working with them on getting it as much exposure as possible. One of the things that I loved about the movie is the way it talked about the land itself. This is something that very few have touched on in books and movies and so forth, how the land responds to the people, yeah, and the people respond to the land. And it reminded me of something that I discovered a few years ago, but specifically in the movie it talks about how when the Jews leave, God turns the land completely barren so that nobody will want to live there. And I can tell you from the personal research that I've done over the years, nobody did live there. I went through census records too, some of which were not even referenced in this particular movie. But there's a wonderful book that was done years ago, which I tell people is really the beginning of understanding of this conflict, and that's Joan Peters' book, From Time Immemorial, because what she does that's so essential is she spends so much time and documentation on this issue of who was living there at the time, you know, and at the time just before Israel became a state. And I did research earlier on that, going back to around the turn of the century, and the statistics are, you know, they don't lie. At the time, for instance, in Jerusalem in 1906, the Jews were the overwhelming population in Jerusalem. About 60,000 Jews lived in Jerusalem in 1906 when this census was done. The next biggest population were the Christians, with between 10 and 15,000, and the Muslim population in Jerusalem was practically non-existent. And the reason is, as the film makes the case pretty persuasively, is that Jerusalem wasn't of any consequence to the Muslims at that time, and because it's just nowhere in the Quran. It's really not a significant part of the history unless you consider Muhammad's famous night journey where he flew on a horse to Jerusalem. But again, back to this idea of the land and the people and how they respond to one another. Another interesting thing I found a few years ago was actually inspired by a Rabbi Cohen. I can't remember his first name, a Brooklyn rabbi who wrote a book called The Prophecies in the Era of Islamic Terrorism. And he had a kind of almost a throwaway observation in there, a reference to a prophecy in Deuteronomy that talks about how God is going to shut up the rains from the land when the Jews are dispersed. And that got me to thinking, well, gee, we ought to be able, like Mark Biltz did. He went back and he found the NASA records on when the eclipses took place. I went back and found that the rainfall charts for Israel. And what I found was astonishing. I went from the late 1800s, when there was really not a lot of rain, but you could chart annually that the rain started to increase as the Jews returned to the land. And then there were two huge spikes where they just practically went off the charts. And that was in 1948 and 1967. Now, when you see these things, you have to ask yourself the question that was asked last night: coincidence? It's pretty startling stuff. So I could talk about Israel all day long, but I don't think that's my place here today. But I want to just leave you with that and one other quick observation, and that is our relationship with the Jewish people. There's going to be a judgment for all individuals. There's going to be a judgment for the nations. And the standard that God uses to judge the nations is how they treat the brethren. And the brethren, we ought to all recognize, unless we're replacement theology people, is the Jewish people. It's the state of Israel. And that's the standard that God uses. And if that's the standard God uses, we better get right with the state of Israel. Thank you very much.